There are different problems. First, the limitation of concentrating only on individual well-being and not our agency, our values, our freedoms, and assuming that happiness reflects that well-being. And second, the inadequacy of happiness as an indicator of well-being of people. That is the question. So one is the question of the correspondence of happiness to well-being, and the other is the question of the status of well-being and the assessment of living standards. Taking the former problem first, one of the major limitations of the well-being-based approach to social evaluation lies in the fact that the same collection of individual welfares may go with very different social arrangements, social opportunities, freedoms and consequences, and an exclusively well-being-based evaluation pays no direct attention to any of these different features, only to utility and happiness. If a person's unhappiness is caused by torture, as opposed to disappointment in life or bereavement in the family, they're treated as equally bad. Whereas in any freedom-based, right-based view, unhappiness generated by torture is not the same thing as unhappiness generated by family bereavement. The same set of utility numbers may go in one case with serious violations of accepted individual rights, but not in another. Or it may involve the denial of some important individual freedoms in one case, but not in another. No matter what happens in these other respects, well-being-based evaluation, of which happiness-based evaluation is a part, would still demand that those differences be ignored in the evaluative exercise, with each alternative being judged only by the happiness totals respectively generated. There's something quite peculiar in the odd insistence that no intrinsic importance at all is given to anything other than well-being, and in this case happiness, in the assessment of alternative states of policies. The neglect applies to overall freedom, including what are called positive freedom. For example, the freedom to have free or affordable elementary education, the right to have unemployment insurance, or the freedom to have basic health care, or women and men to be treated equally, which may entail claims on the state or the society. The neglect applies also to negative freedoms, which demand the absence of intrusive interference by others, the right to personal liberties, the right not to be tortured. It's one thing to see utility or happiness to be important, and important it certainly is. One wouldn't like to be a killjoy in saying happiness is of no importance. But it's quite another to insist that nothing else matters. In particular, we may have much reason to want that substantive note be taken of considerations of freedom in assessing social arrangements. Being tortured is not merely a loss of happiness, but also a basic violation of an important, crucially important human freedom. Second, the informational limitation is made even stronger by the exclusively happiness-based interpretation of individual welfare or well-being, seeing it simply as happiness or as the fulfillment of desires and longings. This narrow view of individual well-being can be particularly restrictive when making interpersonal comparisons of deprivation. I'm not talking about here about the difficulty or impossibility of making it, rather that it gives you misleading signals when it's based on happiness comparisons. For example, comparisons of happiness or the strength of desires can be very misleading as a guide to interpersonal contrast of how well we are respectively doing, since our expectations, our tolerance, our satisfaction tend to get adjusted to circumstances, particularly to make life bearable in adverse circumstances. The utilitarian calculus based on, say, based on happiness can be deeply unfair to those who are persistently deprived, such as the traditional underdogs in stratified societies, oppressed minorities in intolerant communities, precarious sharecroppers or wage laborers without security of employment living in a world of uncertainty, sweated workers in exploitative industrial arrangements, subdued housewives in deeply sexist cultures. The hopelessly deprived people may lack the courage to desire any radical change and often tend to adjust their desires and expectations to what little they see as being feasible. They train themselves to take pleasure in small mercies. The practical merit of such adjustments for people in chronically and hopelessly adverse position is easy to understand. It's a good strategy of living, and this is one way of making deprived lives bearable. But the adjustments also have the incidental effect of distorting the scale of utilities and happiness. In the metric of pleasure or desire fulfillment, the disadvantages of the hopeless underdog who learns to be contented with his misfortunes may seem much smaller than would emerge from a more objective analysis of the extent of their deprivation and unfreedom. Being contented with one's disadvantage, which an indicator of happiness would capture, is not the same thing as not having those disadvantages. So the happiness-based indicators of social achievement is, I would argue, deeply problematic, especially because of the distortion of the scales of interpersonal comparisons. I turn now to the opulent-based measurement, of which the GDP is the most prominent example. One problem that the GDP has as a measure is that it conceals the extent of inequality in the distribution of income. That's one problem. This problem can, however, be overcome through using distribution-adjusted values of GDP, as I've discussed elsewhere, proposing some concrete ways of making these adjustments and applying the methodology to actual empirical data. These were, I'm afraid, some early work of mine in the 1970s, and papers were published at that time in Econometrica and Review of Economic Studies, and in particular a paper called Real National Income in the Review of Economic Studies of 1976, indicated what the mathematics of doing that is. But this is not the only problem to be addressed. That is, integrating distributional inequality within the measure of GDP itself, though I would say that it's worth doing. And in fact, a more basic problem remains, and that is the conversion of commodities into the freedom to live the kind of life that we have reason to value.